And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Richard Dolan, leading UFO researcher and historian, who's returned today to discuss his new book, A History of USOs, which are unidentified submerged objects. This is volume 1 from the beginning to 1969, and it's a comprehensive exploration of mysterious objects in bodies of water throughout history. Richard, welcome back. It's great to have you again.
Thank you, Jeff. It's always a pleasure being on your program, so I'm glad to do it here.
Can we start with you sharing with us some of the most compelling cases that you found? Actually, can we just start with your favorite one?
Oh, man. Well, there's so many. I'll just a very quick preface to all of that is that I've been doing this project. It's been a 3-year project since 2022, and very much a full-time endeavor, where I've sought to first collect and identify the best and most interesting USO cases that I've been able to find from whenever they occurred, from wherever, whatever source I've been able to find them from, and there have been a few which we can talk about later. And I've collected close to 700 such cases from the earliest times right up through 2024, and tried basically to just, as I sometimes think of it, breathing life into these cases because they've almost all been completely forgotten. So I did a lot of scouring of the web, scouring of old periodicals and out-of-print books and magazines, and this is the result. So all of the cases have been all written. The first volume is I published it last month, and the other 2 volumes will be published shortly this year. I'm not sure exactly when, but that's happening. And I found an unbelievably large number of fascinating USO cases that, they're all interesting, but some of the noteworthy ones, there's quite a few that have military implications. About 20% of all of the cases I've found are connected to some nation's military, most of those the United States, many also Russia, Soviet Union. And those are quite interesting. And there's a lot of very interesting civilian encounters over the years that are fascinating as well. I have many favorites. One that I've talked about a bit, which I think is quite noteworthy, concerns the U.S. aircraft carrier, the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. And that was a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier back in the 1950s and 60s. It was retired in the 70s, so it had a long life. And there are a number of UFO and USO encounters that aircraft carrier had in the course of its career. So one comes from 1954, from a former officer of that aircraft. In this particular case, like a lot of the military ones that have come to me, are from U.S. Navy personnel who are retired. And they were under secrecy orders for years, and for one reason or another, many of them decided years after the fact to say, you know what, I'm just going to tell my story. So this man was anonymous, but he stated he was an officer on the FDR, so high-ranking man. He did not give the exact body of water either. I had to try to do some research and try to figure that out, but you can't really know for sure. And what he said is that in 1954, the FDR was on one of the major oceans. It could be anywhere on the Atlantic or up the U.S. side of the Pacific, or the western side of the Pacific, from North America, sorry. He said a large cigar-shaped object descended from above, hung out over the FDR for a short amount of time. He actually went in a minute-by-minute breakdown. It was quite interesting, very specific. And then it ascended back up again, then came back down, and 2 disc-shaped objects emerged from the water. During all of this time, he said weapon systems were not operable. So apparently I think they tried to launch some aircraft. They would not launch. Possibly other weapon systems didn't work either. He wasn't that specific. The 2 disc-shaped objects entered this large cigar-shaped craft. He estimated it was 300 feet long, so very long. So they entered the large disc-shaped object. The cigar-shaped object tilted and then entered the ocean at the conclusion of this. The whole thing lasted, I think, between 20 minutes and a half hour. And he just said, look, I have a wife and family to worry about. I can't really give too much of my identifying information, but this is what happened in 1954. And that prompted me to do a fair amount of research into what the FDR was doing in 1954. And it turns out from where it was stationed in the Mediterranean, it went for repairs that year to Seattle. So it had to leave the Mediterranean, go down the Atlantic, and it was too large to fit through the Panama Canal. So it had to go down the tip of South America and all the way up the other side. So this event could have occurred anywhere along that. I think it's like almost 20,000 miles distance. So we don't really know where this happened. But if I were to guess, I would probably guess the Atlantic portion of South America, but that's just a guess. But it's an interesting case. And it's reminiscent of another aircraft carrier case I like to talk about. This will be in my second volume, but it's a heck of a case. And I wrote a little bit about it in the introduction to this first volume anyway. And that's July 2nd, 1971, aboard the USS John F. Kennedy, another significant aircraft carrier. On that one, we have more specific information. We have the name of the witness who was working communications at the time. And he stated on about 8 o'clock on July 2nd, so very specific in terms of time. He said he heard on the ship's intercom someone screaming, "It's God, it's the end of the world." Yeah, pretty dramatic. At the same time, he said all the communications coming in to the JFK were gibberish. So somehow the communication system was disabled. So he goes out to the deck to see what is happening. And he stated, now it's dark, it's nighttime, but there is this glowing orangey orb-like sphere that was hovering just over the JFK. And he said it gave off about half the amount of light that you would get from sunlight. So it was fairly bright. He only got to look at it for 20, 30 seconds before the ship went to battle stations, general quarters, and he had to go back to his station, where he said for the next 20 minutes, the communications remained down. He implied that weapon systems were not functioning as well. And he doesn't know how the situation ended because he was not a visual witness to that. But that's another interesting case. And there's quite a few of these, quite a few. Those are the military ones. The Russians or the Soviets back then had quite a number of their own. It was a little harder to get exact documentation on just because of the nature of the Soviet state at that time. It was a very bad career and public move to talk about UFOs at all at that time. And so what you find in that country was a lot of these stories just kind of circulated. And then when the Soviet Union fell in 1992, they started coming out, but without a lot of the detail that you'd like for really understandable reasons. But they too had many of these types of encounters, equally dramatic. There's quite a few.
Why do you think it was such a career-ending move in the Soviet Union to talk about this?
That's a very good question. The Soviet Union, for those people who don't remember much about the Cold War, was an authoritarian communist state that existed for about 70 years. And they had very tight control, obviously, over public narratives that existed in that country. Very, very tight control. And for probably similar reasons, the United States also was very down on UFOs, as we all remember. I mean, it was not a good career move in the United States either. And the U.S. government position was always, this is hoaxes, hallucinations, misidentification, and so forth. And the Soviet Union took a similar public position on that, but they just were much more determined to crack down any kind of public discussion for most of its history.
Now, there are reports of both crafts, nuts and bolts crafts, and orbs, right?
That's right.
Do you think that orbs are actually crafts, or do you think they're possibly sentient beings, like some people claim?
It's a fascinating question, and I've really tried studying these reports to try to get some insight into that, among other things. Well, one thing I did in this book is I tracked a lot of specific data points for each particular instance. So I collected about 15 or so data points for each case, and then eventually put them into a spreadsheet, which is publicly available. Anyone can download that. So one of the things that I collected was what is the shape of the craft? It's a simple thing. And I noted that about 20%, just I think 19% of all of the USO cases that I collected were explicitly of some kind of spherical object, or often a glowing orb, would seem like that. So it's a lot of them, quite a few. Disc-shaped objects were a little more common, but spheres were very, very common. Now, a lot of those spheres glowed, and a lot of them did not glow. So there are instances in which people would identify not an orange glowing orb, but rather a gunmetal gray shiny metallic sphere. So that seems like a craft. But there are instances where, like as I mentioned in the case of the JFK from 1971, you don't really know what it was. It was a glowing spherical something. And the question is was there a craft inside there that gave off, let's just say, an intense ionization field that glowed, that made it look as if it was very bright, and it looks like it could be a kind of non-material orb? Or was there something in there? And it's hard to know with some of these. It's very difficult. I think in some of the cases, it did appear to me that you're talking about some kind of intelligent light phenomenon. I could never rule that out. In fact, I suspect that might be the answer to some of them. But without a doubt, a number of them were actual physical and mechanical seeming types of craft. So that's a tough one. When they glowed, the overwhelming number of them seemed to glow in some version of orange. So either yellowish orange or maybe reddish orange, but somewhere along that spectrum. And so it makes it tricky to find out, what exactly are we dealing with? And, keeping in mind too, since from the late 1960s onward, about 3/4 of all of the USO cases I found occurred at night. So again, it makes it difficult. And military cases, since the late 60s, where something like 90% of them occurred at night. So it's very interesting. There's a kind of definite behavioral specificity that you have with these cases. So, but if it's a bright thing at night, like sometimes you just have no idea what you're dealing with.
Can you share with us some of the other ways that you organize the data and what the analysis reveals?
Yeah. This was really fortuitous that I did it at all. My wife, Tracy, kind of midway into the project said, what would be great is if you had kind of like a little checklist of facts for each case. How close was the witness? When did this occur? How large was the craft? What color was the craft? Did the object have an indicated interest in the witnesses and all? And what was it doing with water? Was it under the water? Was it emerging? Was it entering the water? So I collected all of those data points, and so there were a number of very interesting patterns that I noticed once I started organizing that data, which honestly, it's not something I'd ever done before on a large scale. So it was an interesting thing for me. So I noticed a number of patterns that when I studied them made me feel more confident in the authenticity of the data, frankly, because there's a lot of consistency. So here's a few. The one that I like to discuss the most is one that caught me totally off guard when I started looking at it, and that's this daytime versus nighttime pattern. So what I noticed was that right up until the late 1960s, 1967, 68, a slight majority of all of the USO cases that I had found were in the daytime. And by slight, I mean like 51%. So it was roughly even. But even in that early period, what I noticed is military cases were far more likely to occur at night, and civilian encounters were far more likely to occur during the daytime. So that automatically was very interesting to me. But then after 1967, it almost felt like someone flipped a switch, so that all of the cases from that point onward, 75% of them went to nighttime. And that has been the case to this day. Whereas in the case of military, it was still much greater preponderance of nighttime encounters, just under 90%. So it was incredible, very dramatic. That's one thing. So that tells me, or at least my conclusion, is that the operators of these objects went through some kind of behavioral change in the late 60s. And it's an interesting question to ask why that might be. I have a couple of theories. And then B, they also seem to be clearly able to distinguish between civilian and military vessels. So not that we should be surprised by that, but it's interesting that that behavioral change is there. I'll mention one other that I think is very telling and interesting, which is the incidence of electromagnetic interference. So this is one thing I also tracked. How frequently were reports of compasses spinning wildly, or weapon systems going offline, or things like that. And the first of those that I found in connection to USOs happened in 1951. So I have no EM interference cases prior to that. So starting from 1951 to the present, just under 10% of all of the USO cases I've tracked occurred with electromagnetic interference. When you split that between civilian and military, it becomes really interesting. So when you factor out the civilian cases, it's now I can't exactly remember, but it's less than that, where they had EM interference. With military vessels, just about 20% of all military encounters with USOs seem to have some version of electromagnetic interference. So double what you get with civilian. So again, that strikes me as an intentional kind of behavioral change. And then in the few instances where USO witnesses either reported missing time, and there's a few of them, or sightings of alleged beings connected to that encounter, and there's a few of those, not many, but a few. When you have those witnesses were 4 times more likely than the average to report electromagnetic interference. And that's not something that I would have thought to look for, but yet there it is. And so it was very, very piece of good luck that I went down that road and tried to do a kind of a statistical breakdown. There's lots of other things that I found that were also equally interesting that, again, when I reviewed it all, gave me a lot more confidence in the quality of these accounts, because, keeping in mind, a lot of these accounts, there are quite a few of them that are fully supported by either government documentation or just outstanding journalism or investigation and whatnot. And we can feel very, very confident about those. Other cases, however, come to us years after the fact by a single witness. And, you could say, well, that's not as strong in terms of evidence, but nevertheless, the patterns are very, very distinctive in my view.
Can you share with us one of those cases where a being was spotted?
Yeah, I can. I'm just thinking again, this is another military one. And this also happened aboard the USS Franklin Delano Roosevelt, just so happens. I have a few cases with the FDR back during that period. So the witness was a man whose name was Charles Grzinski. And in, I think it was 1958, he was an 18-year-old sailor aboard the FDR. He was a young guy. And he stated he was called up to the deck because there was some weird thing that everyone was noticing. And he said, there was a lot of us on the deck. He said like 20 guys or more were witnesses to this. This bright, very bright, glowing object approached the FDR from above the water. This is not a case in which I can say for sure that the object was in the water. So I have a small number of cases that I included anyway, simply because they connected to the U.S. Navy way out at sea, and I just thought these have to be discussed. So this object comes in, and as he gets to get a better look at it, he's noticing it's this elongated craft, so more of a cigar shaped than a sphere. And he said, I'm looking up at this, and there are these look like windows. And he said, I could see figures. he said I couldn't really make out their exact definition, but he said they did not look human to me. That was his explicit statement there. And so the craft is just hanging out there. There was battle stations were called, but there was nothing. There was no kind of exchange or anything like that between the ship and the vessel, and it just before very long just took off and was gone. So I'm trying to recall if there was EM interference in that case, and I could look it up, but I'm not 100% sure.
The military boats back then weren't nuclear powered yet, were they?
Many of them were. The FDR was. The USS FDR was, I think, the first or one of the first nuclear powered aircraft carriers in the fleet. So that one was, as was the JFK in 1971, which I mentioned as well. During the 50s, yeah, there was a move in the Navy to transition a lot of their fleet as much as they could realistically to nuclear power. In 1954, the U.S. introduced the first nuclear-powered submarine. That was the USS Nautilus. So you're in a kind of a transition phase in the 1950s.
You know how there are cases about UFOs turning on and off nuclear missiles underground? Are there any cases like that where they were turning off nuclear-powered subs or aircraft carriers or destroyers?
There's a Soviet case that comes from, I think it was the Sea of Okhotsk. Okhotsk, it's a tough one. It's a very frigid northern sea north of Japan. You know, it's not a pleasant place to hang out. And I think it was there was a Soviet vessel, not an aircraft carrier, but a large vessel. And this is in the late 80s. So this will come into my second volume, where they said actually, I don't know if this was a nuclear powered vessel. I'm gonna have to double check, but that it was dead in the water for about 30 minutes. So everything got shut off, weapons, comms, and power to the vessel. In the American cases that I'm recalling, I don't know of a single one where the ship was actually stopped dead in the water. It's possible that there are cases that just never came to us, that we don't know about. But yeah, the Russians had it seems to me, every bit as a dramatic history of encountering these things as the U.S. Navy.
With the cases involving missing time, were there ever entire ships where everybody on the ship experienced that?
I'm not aware of any of those cases off the top. I don't think so. And, when we're talking missing time, most of those were civilian cases, as I'm recalling. And so you're talking about a much smaller type of situation, many fewer people. Missing time cases happened in, I'm thinking something like 3% of all of the nearly 700 cases I've gotten. So it's not a huge amount. And then sightings of beings was another about 3%. So we're talking distinct minority of cases, but I have to say, I consider them a significant minority.
Did any of the cases happen within the Great Lakes?
Yes. Most notably Lake Michigan. I have more reports from there than any of the other Great Lakes, but pretty much all of them have reported some activity. In general, I did a breakdown of how many of these cases occur in the oceans and how many occur in freshwater bodies. And it's about 76% occur in oceans. I just looked at this the other day. I think 18% happen in lakes and something like 5% in rivers. So you do have a fair amount of activity in the lakes. The U.S. Great Lakes is definitely an area where a lot's been noted. And, you get them all. I mean, you get cases where these objects were seen emerging from the ocean, from the water, from the lake. You have cases where the objects are seen on a controlled descent into the water. And a few cases where people who are on the water noticed something very crazy below operating in the water. So yeah, Great Lakes without a doubt, and particularly Lake Michigan, for reasons, I don't know if it's just because there's more reporting from there or more genuine activity. I'm not sure.
If we go back to the case where the guy thought the end of the world was happening, Do you think that he was experiencing some sort of telepathic communication? And if not, are there any reports of any cases where there was some type of activity like that?
Yes, not in that instance, no. There was no indication that on the JFK in 1971 that there was a telepathic communication. But it does happen. Most definitely it does. One of my favorite ones, at least comes to mind, took place in the Black Sea in 1990. It was a woman. She was a very accomplished swimmer, apparently. And so she's swimming in the Black Sea. She's out there. Not right at the shore either. I mean, she's maybe a mile or two out at least. And she's there, and she stated, this is sometime in 1990, she saw this metallic, very shiny, basically spherical type of object that was half submerged in the water and maneuvering. She got close to it, and it scared her at first. And then she said, "I heard a message," and it was something like almost exactly this tone. It's like, "It's all right, chill out. It's okay. You're not in danger. You're fine." You know, something like that. And she kind of communed with it for a short while, and then it it went off. It went off on its way, and that was the end of it. Yeah, there's a few of these types of things where people will state that they receive some kind of mental interaction. You get this with a lot of just standard classic UFO or UAP cases as well over land, but they do happen in the water as well from time to time.
Are there any reports of people being injured by being too close to these USOs, like the UAPs?
Yeah, a few. Yeah, famously, this again will be in my second volume, but a number of researchers are familiar with the Colares, Brazil incidents of the late 1970s. That this is at basically the mouth of the Amazon, massive Amazon river system. You know, when the Amazon flows out into the Atlantic, it goes out into a million different channels, and it's an incredible ecological feature, and there's just a massive amount of fresh water emptying out into the Atlantic all the time. And in that region, in a town called Colares in 1977, 78, there were a very large number of UFO and some USO reports that the locals were commenting on. And many of them did involve injuries, and a few did involve death. As far as USOs involving injury, I wasn't really able to find that specifically, but there were many that were definitely shocking and terrifying to the locals during that period. In other instances, no, I can't say that I'm aware of instances in which these objects seemed overtly hostile to people. Now, there are cases where witnesses would have some missing time and feel really, really messed up at the end of it, very confused, like disoriented and disturbed, as if something happened to them, but it's hard to pin those down and to find out what exactly did happen.
Do you think by definition all of the USOs are transmedium? And so I guess you would say they're also UAPs, or we just don't know because some of them never left the water?
No, actually, nearly, here I come with the statistics again, but because I remember them, almost 70% of all of the cases that I tracked had some version of transmedium capability, a very large number. And by the way, a slightly greater number of them were seen emerging from the water, which to me is even more amazing than entering the water, although both are pretty impressive. There was of all of them, about 20% were just strictly under the water. That's it. But no, my feeling has always been that these are, roughly speaking, interchangeable with a genuine aerial UAP. They seem like it. The shapes are the same. You're talking cigars, discs, spheres, a few triangles, a few. which is really what you get with, and also a number that are just described as light. It's hard to know what they were. That's in addition to the spherical ones. So it's kind of the same pattern that you would get with aerial UAP sightings, I think. The fact that so many of them are transmedium just makes me think we're probably talking about the same types of objects and craft, and that they just have this ability to operate in the atmosphere as well as in the oceans.
Are there any hot spots in the ocean that you've come to find out after seeing so many cases in the same place?
Yes. I would qualify this just by stating a lot of the reporting is skewed toward Americans. Americans love to report these. Other parts of the world do not report them as much, or at least we don't get those reports as much as we get the reports coming from the United States. And that's the case. It's always been that way with UFOs. So you're always asked to, you're always wondering, does that reflect genuinely more activity in America, or is it just that we're reporting it more? And sometimes I think it's one, and sometimes I think it's the other. I tend to think there's more activity in other parts of the world that we're just not getting. I've pretty much felt that way for a while. Having said all of that, yes, there are definite hotspots. For me, the most impressive one is the island of Puerto Rico, particularly the northern coast, but also the east and western coasts as well. Very active. Not as much on the southern coast facing the Caribbean, although they have some too. So I don't want to dismiss that, but far more on the northern shore, facing the Great Puerto Rico Trench, and also, if I may just say, the Bermuda Triangle, which has a fair number of these as well. Take it for what you want. So only Puerto Rico, Florida, very, very active on both sides of that peninsula and south of it as well. It's extremely active, a lot of reports. All the way up the U.S. northeastern coast, so from, say, like Virginia going all the way up into like Nova Scotia in Canada. People don't really talk about that much, but it's quite active. And then, of course, you have the West Coast, famous Catalina Island area off of Los Angeles. Yes, most definitely very active. That's the northwestern hemisphere. However, South America, active. And I would say particularly the Atlantic side, you're getting down towards like Buenos Aires, that region in Argentina, pretty active. You're going over into Europe. The Mediterranean has many reports. We're thankful to the Italian UFO organization over there, a group called CISU, the Center for UFO Studies, basically there. They collect many of these. So I notice I have a larger number of Italian cases than any other European. And again, is it because there's more happening there? Well, maybe. Italy is a very big peninsula. You would expect a lot of Italian witnesses, I suppose. But, there's also Greece. There's also the southern coast of France. There's North Africa. They have fewer reports because I think of the reporting mechanisms. But definitely the Adriatic Sea, and also the other side, the Tyrrhenian Sea on the western side, very busy. Go into the Persian Gulf, got a number of cases there. You look at the South China Sea and the Malacca Strait, that kind of choke point of shipping activity. All of these places have had a lot of activity reported. North Central Pacific, by the Aleutian Islands, very, very active. And also, it's almost wherever you look. Throw a dart on the map of the world and you'll get someplace. The Arctic, way up north, both on the Russian coastline and then also when you get toward like, Greenland, Iceland. Very active areas. In fact, I don't think there's any area that I would say is a dead zone. There are fewer reports around the coast of Africa. And there are fewer reports in, like, say, the South Pacific. But of course, there's not a lot of traffic out there. So you're not going to get as many reports. So I think they seem to be everywhere, to be, short answer.
What about Antarctica?
There's a few good cases from down that way. I actually took the time to debunk, I guess I should say, one particular case that was said to occur in Antarctica in the early 1960s, which was actually written about in great detail by an excellent USO writer from 1970. That was Ivan T. Sanderson. And I'm a very big fan of that book. But I think he got this one wrong. He talked about a case where an object was seen coming through, I think he said 37 feet of ice, like blasting through. Chunks of ice going which way. And I mean, incredibly dramatic. It's like you don't get more dramatic than that. But I really looked into that particular case, and it turns out that the main witness who was quoted, he said, look, we actually did have a UFO sighting when we were down there. That's for real. We did not have the case that was described here. And it turns out, I think Sanderson took this report, this is in the late 60s. I mean, there was no internet, hard to do fact checking. And he took it from a magazine, which I have not been able to get a copy of, by the way, but it was from a magazine from the late 60s that seemed to sensationalize what actually happened, because the actual witness there wrote a report to the UFO group NICAP. So he actually made a report, and somehow that report got twisted into this dramatic event at sea. So that one, I felt I had to bring the truth to that one. There are some good cases from near Antarctica, one like South Georgia Island, which is not that far from it. But other cases like right at the Antarctic coastline, I don't have good USO cases from like right at Antarctica. No, I don't.
Are there any reports of a USO crash retrieval being pulled out of the water?
Yes, at least let's say claims of that. Yeah. One I actually wrote about over a decade ago. And was in a previous book of mine, UFOs for the 21st Century Mind. If someone has it, they can find it there too. That was an interview I did with a very, very nice gentleman named David Noble Whitehorse, and he served aboard a U.S. vessel called the Finch in 1962 during something that was known as Operation Dominic. And this was when the U.S. and the Soviets were doing massive amounts of high-yield nuclear detonations, testing the nuclear weapons. It was very extreme at that time. So Dominic was operating out in the Pacific, maybe 500 miles from Hawaii, near a place called Johnson Atoll. And he said, look, this is October. So this is during the Cuban Missile Crisis period, that whole time. He said, we're out there. We were scheduled to do detonation, high yield, high altitude. He said, the funny thing is we always had bogeys. Every time we would do a detonation, we would see regularly tracked UFOs, essentially, is what he's saying. And they would always inevitably disappear just at the moment or just before the detonation, except apparently in this one instance, according to him. And he said during these tests, like most of the crew was ordered to go below deck for their own safety. He said a number of us were pulled up at the last minute, and we were told to, this is a very strange thing, but we were told to stand along one side of the vessel and just look straight ahead. And he's described all the sea spray, everything going on. And he said, we watched this very fast object. He said it looked like a disc-shaped object or maybe a cigar or something, zipping by them horizontally. And he didn't know what happened until he was doing a cross-train with the radar crew later that day. And he said they were all talking about how they tracked this bogey coming out of the sky during the detonation. And they tracked it to a location where it went down in the Pacific, and a bunch of ships were en route toward that location. And he said, that's all that I ever knew for years. And then he said, in the 70s, he was still in the Navy and stationed at Guantanamo Bay, where he had a conversation with another Navy diver, and they, having drinks, trading stories. And this UFO thing comes up. They're like, yo, you think that's a good story? Let me tell you this. And so he learned that this diver was part of that alleged retrieval operation of that exact craft. And according to the diver, he went down, and found himself on top of the craft before he realized that he was, and that he actually, how do you put this delicately? He literally himself under the water, panicked, and he was brought back up. And then he said the next thing he knew that the craft was gone, and it was a failed recovery. That's a weird story because you have to ask yourself, where in the Pacific could he have dove to retrieve this? I mean, the Pacific Ocean goes down to 15,000 feet, and a human diver cannot go down that far. So I don't really know where this happened or what the truth of that was. This is what David stated happened, his conversation. Maybe the craft went down on a unusually shallow shelf near one of the atolls. It would have to be very, very close for him to be able to go down there. I don't really know. There was another story that came to me, though, that was a little more potentially credible. But again, it's second, third hand, so you don't really know. But one person wrote to me and stated that he had a conversation with an ex-Navy guy at a UFO conference. And people should know, like, if you go to a UFO conference, the real action is always not at the lectures. It's after. It's really the private conversations that take place among the attendees and the presenters and all of that. So there he's talking to this guy who was in the Navy and said that he was part of the crew of the USS Nautilus. So that was the first nuclear-powered submarine. And that after the Nautilus had undergone repairs in the late 60s, that it was outfitted with a kind of hatch by which it would be equipped to retrieve smaller USO craft that had come down somewhere in the ocean. It's a tough one to credit fully because you have to wonder. And I had another Navy guy who said, look, I'm very familiar with the Nautilus, and the Nautilus was kind of not even that big a sub, so I don't know what they're talking about. But it does make sense to me that you could employ a submarine for at least limited retrieval operations, particularly if a craft comes down on a shelf. About 10 or 15% of the world's oceans are part of a shelf, so it's shallower. You're not going down 15,000 feet. You're going down maybe 300 or 400 feet, or not more than 1,000 feet. Now, a submarine can go down there and grab something, conceivably, if it had that capability. There's also, claws that have been employed to retrieve wreckage from the bottom of the ocean. Famously, in the 70s, the Hughes Aircraft Corporation had something called the Glomar Explorer, the Glomar, which had a big claw that could go down to the bottom of an ocean. And in fact, famously, they retrieved a Soviet submarine by that in the 70s. So there's possibly different ways by which you could, at least theoretically, retrieve a downed USO. But getting confirmation is a different story. We've got some interesting stories that seem like there could be truth in them, and that is unfortunately as far as we can get right now, without any official confirmation coming from the Navy, which doesn't like to talk about these things.
I think some people would say that we've explored the oceans less than we have of space. If that's true, do you think it's because there's things down there, like potentially bases, that we don't want to find?
It is true that that the world's oceans have not really been explored to the extent that scientists would like. So I was told by Admiral Tim Gallaudet, for example, he stated about 25% of the ocean floor worldwide has been mapped to a very satisfactory level, according to standards that scientists would like, 25%. That doesn't mean that the other 75% is completely unseen, but it's just that 25% has been very well. And then he said 5% of the ocean's volume. And when you think about it, I've read a lot of accounts, I've talked to some people about this too. You go down to the ocean, there's no visibility. You can't see anything. It's like going through the most dense fog, and it's pitch black when you get, below a couple hundred feet. So it's very difficult actually to see what you've got going on down there. I mean, there's things like sonar. We have detection methods that exist to some extent. We have a program, it was once called SOSUS. It's now gone under different names, but it's a sound underwater surveillance system, and by which you've got these acoustic arrays primarily off the coast of the U.S., but some of them go out farther. We don't know how the full extent of this is for obvious reasons. So there are means of detecting either enemy submarines or other anomalies. Like we have that. But it is true, we do not have a full grasp of what is down there just because of the sheer difficulty of the medium of ocean. It's difficult for us. Now, but you bring up another aspect of this, and that is the presence of these others. And how does that factor in? And I've thought about this a bit. You can imagine being like the U.S. Navy in a submarine, particularly during the Cold War, but even today. Like you're down there, and there are Russian subs that are out there. They are very capable. You both have nuclear weapons capabilities, like you can both launch nuclear missiles. It's very dangerous. It's high stakes, and you don't want them coming close to you. You don't, and when you get close to their territory, you've got to be on your guard, and you don't know when you're going to bump into them at any time. So it's a high stakes thing. And then on top of that, you've got the presence of this other that are occasionally tracked at moving at several hundred knots per hour under the water. And we don't have anything that can do that. So, we've got some underwater torpedoes, which might be able to approach some of those speeds, but they can't maneuver. And you know what those are when you track them. Yet we have trackings of these other objects that are maneuvering and are exceptionally high speed. So there's certainly, I think there can be no question about this. There is an understanding among the world's prominent navies that there is someone else down there. And I often liken it to like as a little dance. We see them, they see us. We are aware of them. They monitor us. I think that they are very observant of what we do. And they adapt too. They have adapted to our dramatic changes over like the course of the 20th century and currently. You think about what we have been able to do since the year 1900. So in 1900 was the year of the first actual real submarine. Like we just started getting into the water, and it wasn't that deep, right? We start there. We invent sonar shortly after that, but all of this took time. We didn't really have a major presence in the oceans, I would say, till really the Second World War, which transformed pretty much everything. And then suddenly we have nuclear subs that could stay down, forever. We have a massive commercial shipping industry that, kind of expanded during the whole 20th century. So we really turned the ocean into a major area of traffic during the 20th century to a degree that never existed before. And then developing all the different technologies of detection, and not just below the water, but we put in satellites above, into the atmosphere, in space. So I keep thinking like these others, they're in part they're down there. They're also above in the air, and they're maybe in mountains. Who knows? But certainly the oceans, yes. So they're watching this astonishing development of human civilization during the course of the 20th century. And I keep imagining like they had to be thinking, what are these humans going to do next? Like we have it safe for now, but for how long? And will we have to deal with that at some point? Because the humans see everything, they observe, and they're very clever, and they're coming up with new tech all the time. So I think that there's a lot of adaptation going on, including to this day.
You've been researching UFOs for decades. How has this book and working on it transformed you personally?
Significantly. That's a great question. I've always been interested in the water aspects of this phenomenon, going right back to the beginning of my research. But it was always something that I guess was kind of peripheral to how I studied it. And in fairness, there was just very little work done, and nothing really that comprehensive. There were a couple of good authors in the past who worked this field. The late Carl Feindt. Carl just died about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. He did some very, very good work on UFOs in water. I mentioned Ivan Sanderson. There's a few Europeans who did some very interesting work, including a couple of Russians and a bunch of others. But when I got into the USO phenomenon seriously about 3 years ago, I did it almost not quite as a whim, but in response to a question from a member of my website who was interested in one particular case. And what I often like to do from my website is I'll make private videos and presentations for them. And I did one on this. And it was so interesting. I thought, let's look for some others. And so all through the summer of 2022 and then beyond, I just immersed myself, as it were, into this. And how did it change me? It actually blew my mind to come across so many occurrences, cases, I guess, that, I said they were forgotten, but a lot of them didn't even get to the point of being forgotten. They were like never learned. They just were these events that happened to someone that was like the most shocking experience of their life, inevitably. And it gets written up to a private group and is just stuck in a filing cabinet. And that's it. So what I came to understand was this. I don't know that USOs are anything like a majority of UFO reports. I don't think that they are, but they are a substantial subset of the larger issue and must be incorporated if we really want to have a comprehensive understanding of this phenomenon. You've got to look at the water-based aspect of this phenomenon, because that's a key part. So it's re-energized. I mean, I've been fascinated by this subject without cessation for 3 decades. So, but this subject, I could definitely say, just was like a nice injection of enthusiasm that I developed. I'm very glad that I went into it.
Have you looked into how these crafts have the capability of being transmedium scientifically?
Well, I'm not a scientist. I'm not qualified really to dish it out on that basis. But yes, definitely, I've tried to understand what more knowledgeable people have to think about this. And I think the best kind of explanation that I've found has something to do with the fact that these craft create some kind of ionization field around them that is part of the kind of anti-gravitic effect that they can produce. So, in other words, the creation of a kind of electrical field around them. And it's believed, at least by a number of researchers, that this field creates a kind of cavitation around the craft when they're under the water. So like a bubble, like a protective field that reduces a lot of the friction or drag that would happen, whether in the atmosphere or under the water. And toward that end, you do get a number of these cases where people will really comment on the fact that when they see the craft enter the water, there was no splash. It was almost, at times, the description is like the water almost opened up a little bit for the craft, allowing it to enter the water more easily. And sometimes you get that as well when it would be seen to emerge from the water as well. So that's the best way that I'm able to understand how they do it, that there is this field around the craft that is employed and that somehow is able to mitigate, not completely reduce the effect of the ocean, but mitigate it. I mean, for example, I'm not aware of any of these craft moving at genuine hypersonic speeds in the water. Maybe they can, but the fastest speeds that I've reliably, I guess I could say, come across, we're talking in the hundreds, several hundred knots, like really fast. So I'm guessing that whatever ionization or whatever methods by which they use to get under the water, it definitely helps them go fast, but there are limits when they're in the water.
I was guessing it would be something like Star Trek, where they just have some sort of shield around the ship, and whether they're underwater, which is more dense, or all the way out to space, which is completely less dense, they can just move in between.
Yeah, I think that's about right. I mean, the ionization as I've come to understand, it seems kind of like that shield to a large extent. So I don't think you're off at all.
Well, earlier you were speaking about being at a convention, a UFO convention, and you're going to be at Contact in the Desert. Are you just going to be presenting new material, or are you going to be giving workshops as well?
Oh, well, I'm sure I'll be doing both. So that's still, for me, we're in March, we're 2 months away, 3 months. I should start thinking about what I'm going to do at Contact in the Desert. I expect, though, I'll do at least one full-length presentation on this subject of USOs. I mean, it makes sense. By that time, I'm sure my second volume will be out. Maybe the third volume, we'll see. So I'm sure that will be very much on my mind. Beyond that, probably, I'm sure I'll talk about a few other things there as well. And, we're in an era now in the UFO community, the UAP field, where there's just a lot happening. It's very, very active. There's a lot of news all the time, and I imagine I'll have some comments about some of that as well. Disclosure efforts, Congress, whatever else is happening at the time, I'll probably talk about. I'll definitely do workshops. Yeah. I'm guessing probably. I mean, usually when I do Contact, there's at least 3 or 4 major things that I'm doing there.
Like what?
Well, a couple of lectures, a couple of workshops, this type of thing. So I'll have to look over and see what I'm expected to do, and I'll do it.
I recently had on one of your colleagues, Steve Bassett, and he believes that we're going to be having disclosure very soon. Where are you at with disclosure?
I love Steve. I mean, I've known him for 25 years, and he's a dear friend of mine. Doesn't mean that I agree with everything he has to say about this, and he knows that. So I don't mind taking another position here. He and I have had this discussion, friendly debate for years. So my feeling, though, is, if Steve's going to be right, he's in a better time for him to be right than in the past. But whereas I don't expect like disclosure of the kind that I once wrote about in a book 15 years ago. I'm not expecting like a major announcement from the president. It's not impossible. It's actually, I'm not going to say that it's impossible. Particularly with, we have the ultimate disruptor in the White House, that's Donald Trump. And I mean, people love him or hate him, he is undeniably someone who stirs things up. You see him doing that geopolitically, domestically, and it could be within the UFO space as well. I just don't expect it. And the problem is, it's not that there aren't enough people who desire some kind of truth to break out. We've been having many disclosures for the last decade almost now. It's really quite remarkable. I mean, you think about the things that we have learned since 2017. We learned that the U.S. government did have a UFO investigative body called ATIP. They denied it for years. They said, no, we're not investigating that. We learned that the U.S. Navy particularly has had many shockingly dramatic encounters with these things. And we've learned many specifics about them. We've learned about orders within the Pentagon to report and track these things, and much more. Like, whereas in the old days, we might have thought, well, if we were to know that in the future these things would be learned by the public, we might be thinking, oh, well, there's definitely going to be disclosure. How could they not? And yet there is not this disclosure. A tremendous amount of information has come out. We've had David Grush, for God's sake. I mean, people can say, oh, well, there's no proof there. But I mean, let's just step back here. You have a high level, or at least a reasonably high level government official who had high level security clearances and who was in a position to know, he was part of the UAP task force, who stated point blank, we have alien craft, we have biologics. And yet that was not enough to cause an open disclosure. So what we are seeing is that the U.S. establishment is very resilient on this subject, and they are able to handle a lot of truth bombs that come out and still maintain the narrative of, well, we don't really know what these things are. We're looking into it and we'll get back to you. That's where they're still able to be today. And so to go from there to an actual admission, a disclosure, as Stephen would want or believes, I don't know. I don't see that that's easy. And then the other part of it is, if you're going to do a disclosure, let's say you're the president, like you're Donald Trump, you're going to do a disclosure. First of all, aside from the fact that, you know, practically half the country is going to think you're full of it just because you're Donald Trump, which is a problem, like in terms of public relations, right? It's, you know, in the old days, we used to think, oh, well, if the president makes a statement, everyone's going to believe it. How could you not believe that? Well, we're not in that place anymore. And if it were Biden, it would have been the same thing. You know, you'd have half the country saying you're full of it. So we're not in that place. Maybe that's a minor issue, but a bigger issue is, you make this admission, you're not just going to be able to say, okay, well, I'm done. Yeah, they're here. I'm going to go on vacation, guys. I'll see you in 6 months. Like, that's not going to work, because there's going to be many, many hard follow-up questions. Once you make the admission, that opens up everything for questioning. And this is what I think Bryce Zabel and I did get right when we wrote After Disclosure in 2010. You know, if you're going to make an open admission, now the dam is broken and the water's rushing in, and you've got all kinds of questions that you're going to have to deal with. One that I would like to see is, like, how the hell have you been able to lie to us for 80 years? What have you done to the academic community, the political community, the media? Even that's minor. More important is, okay, so this is real. So what's the story about underground bases, and are you working on their technology, and how far have we gotten? And are there live beings that you're communicating with? Like, how deep does this go? How deep does it go? Because that's the thing that you don't really hear people in the disclosure conversation discussing ever, is when you are telling the truth, what is the truth? Is the truth, yeah, there's something there. We know that they're not human. Okay, are you going to get away with the fact that you're going to say, but we haven't recovered any of their craft? That's not going to be easy to convince people of, I don't think. So then you're going to have to make that admission. And then, of course, that opens up everything, because now you're getting into the cover-up. And this is the one area of the phenomenon that you even now don't really hear media discussing, is U.S. complicity in managing a global cover-up. That's a really difficult situation to be in, and I just can't think that any U.S. president or any decision maker wants to be in that place. On the other hand, what I've said for now 15 years is that disclosure is a bit of a paradox. It's impossible, but it's inevitable. Or you can say it's inevitable, but it's impossible. Either way you want to look at that. In other words, where now you can see publicly that we are developing ever greater levels of momentum to push the narrative of transparency and even disclosure. And there are more and more people coming out. We're having more bombshells. You know, we had Grush, but now we have Jake Barber, and we have a lot of other folks. We have Randy Anderson, who I thought was very, very impressive, and a number of other folks are coming out to talk about this. How many more of them? How many of these types of revelations can the establishment narrative actually handle before it really buckles? And we don't know the answer to that. So on that basis, I would not be prepared to argue against Steve too strongly. If I see that there's a disclosure, I'm going to guess someone's been forced into it by the growing pressure from below. That's the only way that I can really see that it would happen voluntarily. And if that's the case, then you have to assume this is going to be an effort at narrative control to some extent. You know, they're going to want to get out in front of it. You admit certain things in order to prevent admission of other things. That's an old game. So that's the kind of disclosure, I think, if it were to happen, that we would expect. In other words, disclosure, if it were to happen, is not the end of the game. It's the real beginning of the next phase of the game, frankly, the next phase of the battle for truth.
Earlier, you were discussing if the ETs have been observing us for the last 50 years or so and saying how much we've changed. Do you think there's a time limit on that they have to eventually do something because we may start traveling the cosmos and they may want to contain us?
I have to think the answer to that is yes, just because nothing else makes any sense. We have to keep reminding ourselves, as we humans, that we're living in a kind of in a highly unique period of our long history. We've always changed. We're smart and we come up with new ideas, and we're creative. We come up with new ways to make war. We come up with new ways to control Earth's ecosystem and all of that. Like we're good at that, and we're now on a kind of something like an exponential increase. I mean, it was only 3-4 generations ago, let's say 4 generations ago, 100 years ago, that we were in the early stages of figuring out flight. And, we were kind of new with automobiles, and like all of that was new. Radio was just becoming a thing. And now look what we're doing. This is an incredible transformation in just a few generations. And that, I think, is likely to continue in some form. What are the major areas of technological progress going to be? That's hard to know. We're looking at strong AI, clearly. We're looking at nanotech, some version of quantum computing, I imagine, and many other things that are happening that are giving humanity immense control over digital data, first of all, so that we can crunch data in ways that was unimaginable in the past. It's very powerful. So we're doing all of these things. And our eyes and ears on the world are far more sophisticated than they've ever been before. So all of that is a fact, and it's going to have to continue. So I have to assume that any visiting intelligence or intelligences, because I tend to think there's more than one, they have to be very well aware of this. And just like any human long-term planner must think, they too must be thinking, we need to have a position ready for when this milestone is reached or that milestone is reached, and so forth. And the real question is, and here we're just playing speculation, but it's worth asking, like, what are some of the permutations that are possible? Are they, do they have a plan that at some point they're just going to come out in the open and say, okay, here we are? Are they going to do that? Or will they do something to inhibit our technological progress in one way or another? Like, these are important questions, and we don't have the answers to these. At least I don't think that we do. There's all kinds of people out there who claim that they have knowledge of what the aliens or the extraterrestrial or the space brothers or whatever. I have a difficult time. I don't mean to be disparaging, but I have a difficult time taking most of that seriously. Everyone's got an opinion. Everyone seems sure of what they know the ETs or the others are about. But I think if you're just looking at it from what we can confirm, it's really difficult to know. There is reason to wonder that at least one group may not look positively on our development. I see that as not impossible at all, that there could be hostility. You do hear rumors of this coming from different sources from time to time. And then there's the other side of it, in which certainly many people have indicated, if not a positive experience with these other beings, then maybe at least a neutral one. So it's hard to know. They're not easy for us to figure out. Even in terms of the behavior of their craft, sometimes you can get a sense of what you think they're doing, monitoring us being one. But sometimes, I study these reports, USO or UFO reports, and it's not always readily evident as to what the game plan is. Like, what are they doing? So, until we get better confirmable intelligence on their motives, we're just guessing.
Richard, if people want to find out more about your new book, should they go to a website or Amazon?
Either. My website, which is richarddolanmembers.com, has a lot of free material there. You don't have to sign up to be a member to hang out there. But I have a nice link right on the front page of the website there about the books. You can just go to Amazon. You type in Dolan USO, you'll find my book. It's available in 3 forms at the moment. It will be a 4th very soon. So the 3 forms are ebook, paperback, and hardcover. And audiobook will be available soon. I'm in very close communication with my reader for that, and that'll be out. It's very possible for the next 2 volumes, I may try to release all 4 versions at once just to make it easier for folks. But anyway, so it'll be available in 4 versions, and it's an easy find on Amazon for anyone who's interested.
Are you still putting up content on your YouTube channel?
Yes, I certainly do. It's been a little quiet last couple of weeks, but I regularly put information out there. And if I'm not putting up solo presentations on my channel, I try to make up for it by doing interviews like this one, actually, and just keeping myself out there and staying fresh. So yeah, YouTube is fairly, I'm not as active as a lot of other YouTubers are. I mean, I'm not a full-time YouTube person, but I do try to keep a presence there.
Well, before we wrap it up, can you leave us with a last positive message?
You know, when we're dealing with the presence of this other intelligence or intelligences that's here, it's despite all that we have discussed relating to disclosure and UFOs over the last few years, we're still really taking baby steps, because ultimately what we're going to need to do is confront the fact that there are other intelligences that are apparently very sophisticated that are operating here on our planet. And I don't know if that's a wonderful thing or a terrible thing, but I do know it's something that we are going to have to come to terms with and deal with. And I think that we can. Ultimately, I think that we're able to deal with this challenge. I think it's going to be when we are finally kind of sitting into this truth and we're letting it affect our view of the world and of reality, then we have some opportunities here, because, you know, whatever the truth is, I tend to think that we're better off knowing what it is rather than operating on the assumption of basically a major falsehood. I think it can only be a good thing that we know the truth and to face whatever that challenge may be, you know, once it's known to us. The real question is, are we ever going to get to the point where we can truly, confidently know all of the dimensions of this? And I don't know. I mean, that might take some time. This phenomenon, you know, the more that we study it, you start from the 1940s and 50s and move to today, has taken us through many different understandings of what reality even is. You know, in the early years, people weren't talking about missing time or the Oz effect, you know, of UFOs, like, you know, high strangeness. And we're starting to understand now that these objects do represent a extremely advanced and complex science and a more complex understanding of the fabric of reality itself. And we're going to need to understand that. I don't think that that's necessarily a terrible thing. I think we're going to need to understand what that is and have to go through some growing pains, but I don't think it's impossible that we can do it.
Richard, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest again.
Well, Jeff, you know, I've enjoyed every time that we've been able to speak. So I really appreciate you as a host. You ask great questions, and it's a pleasure talking to you.
Well, Richard, I really appreciate you coming on my show, and I just want to say the pleasure is all mine.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.